Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Tuesday tip, where in this video we're going to be talking about how your tires affect the geometry of your bike as a whole. Someone left this in a comment on one of my previous videos months and months ago, and it was a really intriguing concept to me once I sat down and thought about it, because there's a couple things here that I never ever would have considered before that do actually make sense. Now, how practical the implications of this are, I have no idea, but let's just get right on into talking about the different ways that your tires can affect the geometry of your bike as a whole. So with BMX tires, obviously there's different sizes and different PSI ratings, but when you think about it, those sizes and PSI ratings kind of change the way your bike sits on the ground. And this is what got me thinking. So I don't know how well you guys can tell on the video, but there are two different size tires on this bike. We got a 225 up front and a 195 in the rear. And with that, the 210 is obviously a little bit taller than the 195. Some of you out there might already be ahead of me on this one, but let's think about what that could mean. And before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's think about what two tires of the exact same type and PSI rating and size in both front and rear means for the bike. If we have the exact same tire in both front and rear, that means that the bike itself should, in theory, be the same height off of the ground. So if we have the exact same tire in both front and rear, our bike should be lifted the exact same amount. And this is where you probably have caught up to where we're at here. If we have different size tires or different PSIs in the tires in front and rear, that means if we have a bigger tire in the front and a smaller tire in the back, that our bike, this is obviously an exaggeration, is actually at more of an angle back. And we're going to ignore the heater, and we're just going to keep going here. Obviously, the opposite of that is if we have a bigger tire in the back and a smaller tire in the front, which I don't know if anyone does, it's the opposite. We will have a bike that is tilted forward. These are very severe examples here, but it's the concept that we're talking about, because I have no idea how negligible or how practical or noticeable these things are. So, this is where PSI ratings come into play. If we have the exact same tire, both front and rear, but one of them is pumped up to 100 PSI and one of them is 30 PSI, obviously the one that's less is going to give more, and that side of the bike is going to be higher or lower. Now it's at this point that we can consider how these things could have an impact on the geometry of our bike as a whole. First, a very, very obvious one. Let's assume that both tires are the same and both tires are pumped up exactly the same. Let's think about bottom bracket height, because bottom bracket height is the measurement of the center of your bottom bracket to the ground on your bike. So you can think if you've got bigger or smaller tires, that's going to change your bottom bracket height. To connect that back to BMX geometry as a whole, a lower bottom bracket height is generally considered to be a more stable bike, whereas a higher bottom bracket height is generally considered to be a more reactive bottom bracket height. Now, when it comes to the frame itself, a higher bottom bracket height can have an impact on grind clearance for like crooked grinds and other things like that, but raising your tires isn't going to have an impact on that grind clearance. And that's one of those things that I'm considering whenever I'm talking about how negligible or practical this might actually be, because obviously you probably don't want to base your frame choices on your tire size and how much grind clearance you're going to have, but it's something interesting to consider. Now let's move on to what I think is the most interesting of these concepts, because it actually does make sense in my mind. Let's talk about head tube angle. Head tube angle is quite literally the angle of your head tube. A more steep head tube angle means that your handlebars are more straight up and down and your wheelbase is closer together, and it also is generally accepted to be a more twitchy, more reactive geometry on your frame to have a steeper head tube angle. The opposite of that, a mellower head tube angle, is generally accepted to be more stable and less reactive. Trail riders, for example, like mellower head tubes because they like to be more in control and more stable going through the trails. So let's think about what different tire sizes could mean for this. On this bike, and in the past, trail riders, I feel, I may be wrong on this, but I feel trail riders have run bigger tires in the front and smaller tires in the back. And I don't know if it was because of this or just the way it was, but if you think about it, having a smaller tire in the back and raising this up a little bit could have a similar impact to having a more mellow head tube, because it's bringing your bike at more of a backward angle, just like you're seeing here. It's bringing that head tube angle more mellow at the same time. I don't know what impact this has, like I said, or if it would have any impact, but it kind of makes sense when you think about it. This is also something to take into consideration with that tire pressure example. If we've got higher tire pressure in the front and lower in the back, that means that the bike's going to be at an angle just like this, and it could have that impact on our head tube angle, or the effective head tube angle. So with that, the opposite, lower tire pressure in the front, higher in the back, or smaller tire in the front, bigger tire in the back, it's going to effectively steepen your head tube angle. Neither of these things have an impact on the wheelbase of your bike, which is something that plays a huge part in how reactive and how it feels during spins and tricks like tail whips and turning and controlling the bike. So once again, not sure how practical these things are, but I thought it was super interesting to think about this concept and think about the way that tire size, PSI, and kinds even, because different tires from different brands can be measured not exactly the same. They may say the exact same size, but I know we've all seen examples of tires in the same size from different companies that are totally different when inflated. Let me know your guys' thoughts on this concept. I thought it was really cool and I wanted to bring it to you guys. And hopefully, if you're new here or you haven't yet, you'll hit the subscribe button down below while you're leaving a comment. I want to thank you guys all for being here and watching. And hopefully we'll see you tomorrow for another video.